When the guns finally fell silent at Dien Bien Phu, the war that had shattered a generation of French and Vietnamese soldiers was over. But peace, like victory, would prove elusive. In July 1954, diplomats from around the world gathered in Geneva, Switzerland. Inside a grand hall lined with marble and flags, they met to decide the fate of Indochina. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and quiet mistrust. The Cold War had come to the negotiating table. The Geneva Accords ended nearly a century of French colonial rule. Vietnam would be divided temporarily along the 17th parallel, the demilitarized zone running roughly from the Laotian border to the South China Sea. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh would govern from Hanoi. In the south, a provisional government led by Emperor Bao Dai, and later by a rising politician named Ngo Dinh Diem, would take control in Saigon. It was meant to be a pause, not a partition. The agreement promised nationwide elections within 2 years to reunify the country under a single government. But even before the ink had dried, both sides doubted that promise would ever be kept. In the north, the victory was celebrated as the dawn of independence. Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, pledging land reform, literacy, and equality. Portraits of the bearded revolutionary adorned homes and schools. But behind the optimism lay hardship. Years of war had devastated the economy, food was scarce, and social divisions remained deep. The new government embarked on sweeping land reforms, seizing estates from landlords and redistributing them to peasants. Yet these policies often turned violent. Accusations, denunciations, and executions scarred entire villages. For Ho Chi Minh's government, revolutionary zeal sometimes outweighed mercy. In the south, meanwhile, uncertainty reigned. The French withdrew, leaving behind a fragile administration. Into this vacuum stepped Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch Catholic, fiercely anti-communist, and deeply ambitious. Born to a Mandarin family, Diem saw himself as the moral savior of a divided nation. Backed by his influential brothers and supported by American advisors, he moved quickly to consolidate power. Washington saw Diem as a bulwark against communism. In the logic of the Cold War, the fall of Vietnam might trigger what U.S. officials called the domino effect, the idea that if one nation in Southeast Asia turned communist, others would soon follow. To American policymakers, supporting Diem was not simply about Vietnam, it was about containing Moscow and Beijing. Billions of dollars in aid poured into Saigon. U.S. military advisors arrived to train the fledgling South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN. Roads were repaired, schools rebuilt, propaganda spread through radio and posters promising freedom and democracy. Yet beneath the surface, Diem's rule bred resentment. He favored Catholics in a largely Buddhist country, staffed the government with relatives, and suppressed dissent. Rural peasants, once promised reform, saw little change. And in the countryside, remnants of the Viet Minh who had stayed behind quietly reorganized, forming the seeds of a new insurgency. By 1955, the fragile Peace of Geneva had already begun to unravel. Refusing to hold the promised elections, Diem declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam after a controversial referendum that removed Emperor Bao Dai from power. The North denounced the vote as fraudulent, the South dismissed the North as illegitimate. Two governments now claimed to represent one country. Ho Chi Minh, in Hanoi, announced that unification would come through struggle. Diem, in Saigon, pledged to crush any communist threat within his borders. Vietnam was no longer merely divided by a line on a map, it was divided in heart and ideology. Across the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands, whispers of rebellion grew. Former Viet Minh fighters hid weapons in rice jars, rebuilt underground cells, and began assassinating local officials loyal to Diem. In response, the South Vietnamese government launched brutal crackdowns, imprisoning thousands of suspected communists and dissidents in hastily built camps. Families were torn apart, villages emptied, fear spread like wildfire. In the north, meanwhile, preparations began for what Ho Chi Minh's advisors called the Long Resistance. Factories were moved underground, soldiers trained in guerrilla tactics, and the first supply routes south, the earliest trails that would one day form the Ho Chi Minh Trail, were quietly established through Laos and Cambodia. Both sides believed time was on their side. For Diem, the years ahead would bring modernization, stability, and American support. For Ho Chi Minh, patience and ideology would reunite the country. Neither realized that Vietnam was being drawn inexorably toward another, larger war, one that would soon engulf the world's most powerful nation. By 1956, the deadline for national elections came and went. There was no vote, no reunification, only silence and suspicion. The demilitarized zone along the 17th parallel became a symbol of division, two opposing systems staring at each other across minefields and barbed wire. In Saigon, Diem's advisors reassured him that American strength would deter the North. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh's generals spoke of patience and preparation. Both men believed history favored them. But history, as ever, would prove indifferent to the hopes of men. For the people of Vietnam, farmers, students, monks, and mothers, the dream of peace had lasted barely a season. Once again, soldiers marched, propaganda blared, and suspicion seeped into every home. The war that had ended French rule had merely changed its face. And as the 1950s gave way to a new decade, American advisors began arriving in greater numbers, unaware that they were stepping into a conflict they would not fully understand, nor easily escape. Next, the advisors become soldiers. And Vietnam, a nation divided, becomes the stage for a new kind of war.